Distinguished guests, dear media friends, good afternoon. Welcome to CCG Global Experts Dialogue events. I'm Luo Yan, the Communication Director of CCG. Firstly, please allow me to introduce the distinguished guest, the Vice President of Paris Peace Forum, the former Director General of the WTO, Mr. PASCAL LAMY. And discussants, Sun Yongfu, CCG Senior Fellow, the former Ministry of Commerce of the People's Republic of China, Director General of the European Affairs, Ji Wenhua, Professors at School of Law, University of International Business and Economics, Li Siqi, Associate Professor at China Institute for WTO Studies, University of International Business and Economics. Thank you all for coming on a snowy day. Next, let's welcome the President of CCG, Dr. Huiyao Wang, to give a welcome remarks. Welcome.
Okay, thank you, Luo Yan. And so, Your Excellency, dear friend, PASCAL LAMY, and of course, our distinguished friends and CCG fellows and media friends, and of course, our people from embassy, from different think tanks in Beijing. It's really a great honor for us to carry this CCG Global Dialogue in the amongst the snow in Beijing. We have a big snow, but also it's in Chinese saying the big snow signifies a good harvest year, and we hope that will bring the good luck for us. So PASCAL brought us the snow, but I think it was really great that we have a purifying environment for Beijing. I mean, CCG in the past number of years, particularly in the last 3 and 4 years since COVID, we have conducted many global dialogues, and PASCAL was actually taking the time to come to CCG dialogue 2 times online, and then it is, I think, 4 years ago we had a PASCAL physically here in Beijing, and I'm very glad to see that he's coming back again after the COVID pandemic. So this is really a great occasion to welcome again distinguished guest of PASCAL. And we just had a very good lunch with PASCAL with CCG Honorary Chair Minister Chen Deming and Minister Yi Xiaozhun, who former DDJ of WTO, and many friends in Beijing. And so this is a very good occasion. We have brought PASCAL to CCG venue to give us his keynote, and then we have some dialogue, and then we have some discussion with PASCAL. So here I would like to, on behalf of CCG, welcome Mr. LAMY, and of course I would like to formally introduce him as well. I know that PASCAL also was a great driving force behind the Paris Peace Forum. He was the former president of a Paris Peace Forum, which now become a very well-known, internationally notable, flagship event of globalization, launched by President Emmanuel Macron. And PASCAL was the driving force and the first president of this Paris Peace Forum. He's now still the vice president of Paris Peace Forum, and he's also a coordinator of the Jacques Delors think tanks, which have office in Paris, in Berlin, in Brussels. And of course, he's very famous to be known as the former Director General of the WTO World Trade Organization. And of course, he was also the former Trade Commissioner of the European Commission, among his many, many titles. So he's also the president of the members of various boards with a global European or French vocation. For example, European Selfish Mission, Moral Abraham Foundation, European Climate Foundation, EFRI, PECC, CERE, TMEA, Antraca 2020, UNDC 2025 provision. He's involved on the board of those many organizations, and of course, he's also at the Transparency International, Alphabet Forum, Beijing Forum, World Trade Forum, WEF, Global Risk. Just to I lose the count. There's so many so many of that. And last time I had met PASCAL at the Paris Peace Forum just in last month, and before that we were at Salzburg Trilogue, which PASCAL is a frequent speaker there. He's also a professor at the China European International Business School, CIPS in Shanghai, and he's going to go to Shanghai tomorrow. And then he's also a professor at RCC in Paris. So this is really a very good background of PASCAL, and so he actually served as a two consecutive terms as the DG of the World Trade Organization, and of course with European Commission as well. So he has actually also he has become the director of cabinet of the European Commission of the President Jacques Delors, and he's a G7 Sherpa in the early 1985 to 1994, and director of the cabinet of the French Prime Minister from 1993 to 1995, and of course the French Minister of Economic and Finance in 1981 and 1983. And I was very impressed when PASCAL gave us the photo that in 1986 he was accompanying Jack Lewis to met late leader Deng Xiaoping at that time when China just opened a few years ago. So today we are very interested to have him, PASCAL, to give us his speech and his outlook of what's going on in the world, and what has been the how we can reimagine the international trading system for re-globalization. So this is really a very interesting topic, as we know that we are facing with all kinds of a crisis. I mean, we had the war in Ukraine, we had a conflict in the Middle East, and we have I mean, previously we had other economic and trade war also, so that's really, and of course out of this we have the biggest war is the climate we have to fight as mankind. So there's many issues we're going to talk about. I think PASCAL will share his great wisdom and his advice to us, and I'm sure we'll have a good discussion after that. So I appreciate all the guests, and I want to also point out we have Bill Clyven, the former deputy head of U.S. Embassy. He's now also big with a big company now in Berlin. Is also with us today. So we had many people coming for this this afternoon discussion. So without further ado, I would like to invite PASCAL to give his keynote, and let's welcome PASCAL to give us keynote.
Come in. So, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Many thanks to my good friend Henry Wong, and glad to be back in presence to the CCG, with which I've had a long-standing working relationship. Unfortunately online since December 2019, which is why I'm extremely glad to be back here. In the meantime, CCG has grown. It's much bigger than it was last time. So congratulations for that. You've saddled me with an incredibly huge topic for a 15-minute talk, which is reimagining the international trade system in times of re-globalization. But I'll try to remain within my time allotted limit, starting with some nuances I would have on the notion of re-globalization. I know it's an invention of Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, which I like a lot, so I will not disagree a priori with an excellent DG of WTO. But it might imply that we are deglobalizing and that we should have to re-globalize. And this if this is the concept, I don't agree with this concept because I don't agree that we are deglobalizing. I agree that globalization is changing and that if re-globalizing means moving to a different kind of globalization, I agree. But not if re-globalization means moving back from globalization and then because of that, back to globalization. We are living a time of change in globalization, a big inflection that we are witnessing. The old globalization was powered by three major engines: technology, ideology, and peace. And the three engines were pulling globalization together. They were all aligned to pull the period we have known roughly from the 1970s or 80s to roughly 2010. We now are in a quite different period in which the three engines do not work the way they were previously. Technology keeps pushing globalization. This world is interconnected and more every day. So there is a huge potential of further globalization, notably in services with digitalization. Ideology is not today where it was 20 years ago. Today, 20 years ago, there was a sort of ideological consensus that opening trade was the way to go because of the merits of international division of labor, specialization, multilocalization of production systems, spanning the planet with global supply chains. The consensus at the time was that that was the way to go and that obstacles to trade, either existing or to come, were to be addressed and reduced. This has changed. In today's ideological picture of the relationship to trade is much more mixed. Now, you hear people saying trade should be reduced for reasons of national security. And you hear people saying trade should be reduced for reasons of social security. And you hear people saying trade should be reduced for reasons of environmental security. So the ideological landscape has shifted. And as far as peace is concerned, I think you don't need a long demonstration to show that this world is not in peace. Not only is it not in peace, it never was really in full peace, but there was no real big fight, battle, war, as the one Russia started by invading Ukraine, or as the one which Hamas started in attacking Israel. Although so far this has not resulted in a full-blown war in the Middle East, we know that the ingredients of that may be there. So we now are in a world where wars are multiplying and expanding, and this is within a context which has gone worse for the last 20 years, every time, hopefully for the moment stabilized, which is the US-China rivalry. And this, of course, has a lot of bearing on both the geoeconomics and the geopolitics of this planet. So we are in a different phase of globalization. Trade keeps growing. We've had record volumes of trade in 2022 by the statistics. True, there are some elements of fragmentation. And you can see that in investment flows way before the war in Ukraine. the US investment of China had dropped, went roughly from 20 billion a year in the years 2010 to 8 billion in 2020. So in 10 years, it moved down. Same, by the way, for EU investment in China, and same, by the way, for Chinese investment in the US or in EU. So if investment is a precursor of trade, there were signals that already before this major tectonic geopolitical development that the war in Ukraine triggered, some elements were there. But these elements coexist with an increase of trade. So we have both the volumes of trade growing, which is an element of globalization, and some elements of fragmentation. What this will mean for the future, in my view, is unclear, although overall, if I look at these three engines, technology, ideology, and peace or geopolitical tensions or conflicts, I still believe that overall, these engines will keep pushing for globalization. Now, what does this mean for the international trading system? Agreements are becoming much more difficult because of this polarization, not just East-West between US and China, but also North-South. If you look at the votes at the General Assembly of the UN about Ukraine or about Palestine and Israel, you can see that this world is now emotionally divided in two camps. In the case of Ukraine, those who buy the narrative of Putin that NATO was strangling Russia and that Russia had to intervene in order to be not strangled in the future, which in my view is total nuts, but some people believe this, and I have to recognize this. These people believe this, and it's exactly the same with Hamas and Israel. A lot of people on this planet believe Israel is a colonizer. This is not my view, but I have to recognize that emotionally, a lot of people see things very differently than we Europeans. So this ambience is not conducive to proper international cooperative arrangements. And there are many reasons for that. The legacy of colonization, the vision by many emerging countries that the international system is not fit for purpose, according to today's relative power distribution, the way we handled COVID, which in my way, and I coined this phrase, was a sort of vaccine apartheid, which I deeply regret, and many other issues are creating a sort of frustration, which Ukraine or Palestine are inflating. This being said, we need the international trade system to address a few issues. Most of them it has not properly addressed in recent times, and some of them being new. And I will mention 4 of these issues, which in my view are the correct answer to Henry Wang's question. The first one is trade and environment. The second one is trade and digital. The third one is economic security. And the fourth one is subsidization. Now, on trade and climate, I have to remain short. I spent a week in Dubai last week talking about this and other topics. We have a big problem in that the world trading system and the world climate systems are totally different. On trade, we have norms and no target. And on climate, we have a target and no norms. In the WTO, nobody says trade should be open 60% or 80% or even 100%. No, we just have rules of behavior that slowly reduce obstacle to trade in a fairly negotiated way. And the fact that it is fairly negotiated is proven by the fact that countries agree to it. On the climate side, it's exactly the other way around. We have a target, which is zero carbon, which is great. I'm all in favor of that because I chaired the Climate Overshoot Commission during 2 years, and I now know what global warming really means and what we should do in order to address it. But the way we do it is left to nationally determined contribution. So WTO works with multilaterally determined contributions, and climate works with nationally determined contributions. And as a result, you have a mess in trade. We Europeans price carbon, big way. But the moment you price carbon seriously, trading with countries where the price of carbon is extremely low is a big problem. Because if you do that, you just incentivize carbon leakage. Producers within your constituency will move outside and emit carbon elsewhere. So the more you fight carbon in your constituency, you trigger more leakage and more carbon emissions elsewhere. So it makes no sense, which is why EU now needs a CBAM. But the US don't like pricing carbon, so they do it subsidization. So they can print dollar as much as they want. And in doing this, we Europeans create a trade obstacle at our border with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and the US create a trade obstacle in totally leveling the playing field with their massive subsidization system to greening their economy. And this has trade consequences which need to be addressed. So we need the WTO to intervene. We need WTO members to sit around the table and discuss, I'm doing it this way, you are doing it that way. Let me understand why you do it this way. I will explain why I do it this way. And at some stage, we will have to find something which is reasonably compatible. And in order for it to be compatible, it has to be comparable. And just the way of making these climate-related trade measures compatible is a big thing, which I think needs to be done urgently. Otherwise, it will slow decarbonation. These trade frictions, if we don't address them, will slow something which we're already way too slow to address. Digital trade is in a bit of a better shape. There has been a negotiation for now quite a number of years. There is a digital trade facilitation package on the table. And my view is that the next ministerial conference should pocket what's on the table and stop discussing, maybe we could do this, plus this, plus this. There is a good base on the table in present circumstances. If you have a good base on the table, pocket it, and then move from there. And this, in my view, is something which is relatively doable now. Economic security is, of course, in this context, which I briefly described, also a big problem. Mr. Trump pretends that exports of steel from Europe to US are a threat to US security. Nuts, total nuts. But for a variety of reasons, the EU decided, and I disagree with that this case should not be brought to the WTO. Whether EU or US export restrictions to China in the ground of national security are or not justified is an open question. We know that there is a security exception in the Charter of WTO. We know that this has already been litigated. So the WTO can adjudicate a dispute about economic security. But I believe that given where the dispute settlement of WTO is, given that the US are on strike, something should be done by the members of WTO to give some sort of guiding interpretation of what economic security can do. I totally agree that sovereigns need a margin of maneuver, which is their sovereignty and does not have to be appreciated by whatever judge in WTO on grounds of national security. But this, on the other side, cannot be a blanket exception. You cannot do anything just by waving your flag national security. This will destroy the multilateral trading system. So we have an issue there, which I think necessitates a better attention. And finally, subsidization, which is not a new issue. China knows that full well. The problem being that with IRA, the US have turned Chinese. They now subsidize their industry as much as China used to do it. After having, by the way, complained in the past that China was too heavily subsidizing its industry, which is absolutely true, hence the level of overcapacities which we now have in the Chinese economic system. So that would be my sort of 4 priorities, trade priorities, of course, related to other issues. And finally, for my few last minutes, what could EU and China do to move this forward? I think the overall answer is not much, given the state of relationship between EU and China, which has seriously deteriorated. The main reason why it has deteriorated is the war in Ukraine. We Europeans do not understand why China sides with Russia. China did not recognize the annexation of Crimea by Russia in 2014. So China probably does not like a country invading or seizing the territory of another country. So why is China siding with Mr. Putin? The interpretation can only be that Mr. Putin is against the US and Europe, so China is moving with Mr. Putin because it is against the US and Europe, which then in Europe creates a perception that China does not like us and is against US and Europe. And by the way, putting US and Europe in the same bag, which in my view is a large over-interpretation of the situation. So the politics for the moment are bad, and it's very difficult to have proper economic discussions in such a political context. And the economics are not good either. The growth in Europe is low, too low, for Europe medium term to entertain its social market VHF system. And the Chinese economy is not, in my view, in good shape. And the structural characteristics of the Chinese economy, which is the over presence of the state-owned system, that leads to a number of production capacities not abiding to market rules, hence these overcapacities with the sub-consumption in China. I mean, if you compare China to other developing countries of the same sort of range, the saving rate of the Chinese people is way too low, which is why their consumption is way too high, which is why their consumption is way too high. And this structural problem is at the origin of our trade problem. A 400 billion trade deficit is not a trade problem. It's a macroeconomic problem that needs to be addressed macroeconomically. It's not in twisting. I mean, Of course, trade negotiators can do their job. They will do their job. If they do properly their job on this 400 billion deficit, maybe they will address, I mean, at the best, 100 billion. Yeah? China would open more its services market, and EU would rebalance part of the problems she has in a number of respects. But this will not shrink the 400 billion. The 400 billion are there for other reasons, as, by the way, the US massive and permanent trade deficit is there for macroeconomic reasons, which is that the US consume too much and save not enough. So this is a difficult situation, which I think we need to recognize. And on this side, the EU is not yet seen by China as a proper geopolitical interlocutor. China still is unsure whether in the future EU will remain a proper economic integration process, or whether at some stage the dreams of Europeans that they will become a sort of full-fledged both geoeconomic and geopolitical power will be fulfilled or not. So China is very careful about this, carefully plays some of its cards with the member states, some of its cards with the EU institutions. And as long as we Europeans remain in this situation, I can understand why China will be cautious, and why some in China still will believe that EU is an American poodle, and that in these conditions, we'd better be careful with what we do. We have a problem also on our side, which we need to address. This being said, and that's my final point, this being said, there is ample room for EU and China looking, for instance, at the four topics I suggested: environment, digitalization, economic security, and subsidization, and in moving more together in moving these issues into the trading system. So there is room for that. The context is not propitious, but statesmen and stateswomen are there to address, including negotiation or discussion in a context which is not favorable. And this is what would be my recommendation, is that on both sides, these issues are taken, recognizing that the environment for the moment is not right, but sometimes it's the deal you make when the environment is not right that contributes to change the environment, and that's what I wish. Many thanks for your attention.
Okay. Great. Thank you, Pascal, for your excellent speech. And so you have really highlighted many key issues and challenges, and of course opportunities that we have to, work together. Of course, we know that economic globalization has really faced strong headwinds in recent years, marked by challenge of ranging from rapid technology change, which you mentioned about, increasing extreme climate events. We see the COP28 just happening, and of course also the supply chain issue. There's also of widening inequality in different parts of the world. So and of course the WTO organization has come and strained in many aspects. So you are a global visionary. You are a global governance reform also champion, and I know you have led many groups of that. So you said you just come back from the Dubai on this climate COP28, and you were there. So I understand you championed the climate overshooting commission, which is a very very interesting initiative. I've done a lot of research, and then you have proposed the CARE reaction, which is cut the emission, adapt the climate, the lifestyles, and of course remove the carbon, and of course explore. So perhaps given you are coming back from the Dubai, and then on this COP28, and then this trade and climate, and it also closely related. So maybe you can elaborate a bit on your vision of the climate change challenges and views on give us some update on that. On your what's your takeaway on the 28th of COP28?
Well, I mean, I believe environment, climate change, and biodiversity degradation are our #1 problem. When I was 40 years old, I thought social justice was our #1 problem. And I'm not saying it's not a problem, but I think now, collectively, this is a life or death issue for this planet. So it's our #1 problem. Biodiversity is a big problem, but science is more divided on biodiversity, notably because biosystems have an inbuilt capacity to morph or regenerate, which physical systems do not have. So climate change is the problem #1, and we need to ramp up our game because we are late. The name of the commission, the Paris Peace Forum, created, and I had the privilege to chair with a lot of old monkeys and luminaries of my kind. And I selected a commission with a majority of people coming from the South. It's the first time ever a global body looking at climate issues was composed of a majority of people coming from the South. And I can tell you, it changes a lot of the discussion and vision. We did it because we believe the risks of overshooting 1.5 are now extremely high. By the way, science tells us that we will overshoot 1.5. The open question is whether, for how long will we do it? Do we still have a capacity to decrease this 1.5 augmentation of temperature once we've done it? And this is the open question. So the open question now is not whether we will overshoot or not. It's for how long will we overshoot, and are we able to regain the necessary trajectory? The conclusion of these 2 years of deliberations is that we have to look at all the options which you mentioned: cut emissions, adaptation, remove carbon, and explore geoengineering, which is a very controversial topic. I will be dealing with that later tonight with Shui Lan, who was a very famous Chinese professor and who was a member of the Climate Overshoot Commission, including exploring geoengineering in case. And what we recommend is that these options are considered together with the trade-offs it may imply. And this, of course, is quite a bold proposal. We propose that the North phases out fossil fuels, and this is, as you know, discussion in Dubai, and at that time they might have found a compromise. We propose things like take-back obligations, for instance, which is a big innovation in the way we would handle climate change, so that not just cutting emissions, but also removing carbon. We propose to explore geoengineering technology, including solar radiation modification, with a moratorium for risky experiments, because some of these experiments may be very risky. The trade side of the report is minimal. I did not want to bother my colleagues with my trade issues, although we propose to create within the WTO what I mentioned briefly a moment ago, which is a comparability forum, where countries having different trajectories, different policy instruments, different policies, and different ways to use it, there is some sort of coherence within the way countries address their decarbonation trajectory, which for the moment is not the case. And I think, and I believe, that WTO should be more affirmative. Now, we all know that the WTO is members of the WTO, and that the DG is not running the shop, or partially in some circumstances with some parameters. But I personally believe that developing countries are wrong to resist a discussion on this in WTO, as I believe developed countries are wrong to resist a discussion on this at the COP, at the Paris Agreement COPs. I think this is stupid. The problem is there. And if you refuse to address it for matters of principle in one organization, and the others refuse to address it in another organization, it's typical diplomatic blockage, which makes absolutely no sense. So the first thing to do, and that's the concrete answer to your question, Henry, is let's discuss this issue around the table, both in WTO, which is a trade-related organization, and in COP, which is an environmental-related organization.
Great, and that's a good explanation. I think you're absolutely right. I think all the countries developing, and because I think we need to find a compromise and find a solution to address this issue, which is very urgent in the world agenda. And also, of course, France was the country where the Paris Accord was reached, almost a decade ago. So that's really important that we continue that. I know you have also, not only on the climate, you've been really also championing on the digital. I mean, we were on this digital steering committee of the digital global governance, and then Europe and US and China all have some different standards, and now we know that the digital world is already a reality, and that's something WTO wasn't really addressed enough in the past. So how do you see this converging of the digital world? And that's where the driving force of the global economy, and China become the second largest digital economy, and with 1 billion smartphone users and 70% of the 5G system in the world. So how do you see the digital world come along and become really not divided, and particularly on standards, on governance? And you have done a lot of work on that. Maybe you can share a bit of that as well.
No, I believe a digital world will be ideologically fragmented, whereas the analogical world was much more flat. A bicycle is a bicycle everywhere on this planet. A shirt is a shirt. A shoe is a shoe. A cow is a cow. There is no ideological big difference. Data are an issue which people see very differently depending on their philosophical or political or moral positions. So you don't have what intellectuals call cognitive dissonances about cars or shoes, but you have cognitive differences between countries and civilizations on data, which is why, for the moment, we have a Chinese system, we have a US system, and we have an EU system. And the differences in these systems stem from philosophical differences. And we all have good reasons to stick to the values which we believe in and in which we have been educated and shaped. Now, there's one big question mark in this in this triangle, which is where will India go? India is potentially a major digital power. Whether India will go Chinese, I doubt it. Whether India will go US, maybe, or EU, maybe, or India. After all, they have a domestic market that allows economies of scale. That would make sense. So that's the difference between the previous world. Inevitably, the regulation of the use of data, privacy, storage, accessibility, transborder flows, control, this is different. So there will be only limited convergence. Now, there is convergence. If you look, for instance, at the way China regulates platforms to avoid excessive market power, we do it exactly the same way in Europe, exactly, for the same reasons. So our digital competition attitude is very similar. It's different in the US for the moment, and as you know, it's changing. So it doesn't mean a sort of clustered world. In some areas, we will have, at least compatible, if not similar attitudes. In other areas, we have to forget convergence and organize coexistence. And in the digital world, coexistence means interoperability, technically. And this is true both for software and for hardware. And this is where the WTO comes in. WTO is one of the levers. We will not level the playing field, but we will avoid the level playing field for the reasons I rapidly gave, to have too many cost consequences. Inevitably, a divided system in a global market capitalist system, whether you like it or not, is more costly than a level system because of simple reasoning on economies of scale. So now, the WTO is not the only international organization that can try to make the system interoperable. The ITU has a role to play. I think, by the way, organizations like the Paris Peace Forum, where you have not only sovereigns, but also big multinational companies, NGOs, major academic institutions, think tanks, can also help moving this in a compatibility direction. But this is where the WTO should intervene, where there are the necessary space for facilitation and compatibility and interoperability. This should be the focus. I don't think the WTO should tell EU or China or US how they should regulate. This is an issue for them to decide, but adjusting the interstices is where the WTO should step in.
That's a very good inside view. I mean, of course, the Paris Peace Forum has done already quite a lot in terms of bringing all the players together, and then you have also proposed many good suggestions. So absolutely, I think how to coexist the different system where WTO can also play a very important role. Just changing a little bit on that, I noticed that the EU has recently had some new courses and a new standard on AI. There's a new agreement on that. So what do you think about AI now? I mean, also it's become a bit of a summit between President Xi and President Biden in San Francisco, where Graham Allison sent me a article that of his, he was co-author with Henry Kissinger, the last piece of Dr. Kissinger on this AI threat, possible side effect that that the human beings may have, may not be able to control, and what do you think about that, and how China, US, EU can work together on this AI future, whether we can harness or whether we're going to be controlled by it. What's the way to get into that?
Well, I'm an optimistic, which does not make my life easy in present times. I believe AI has offers huge opportunities in areas like science, medicine, for instance. I also believe AI entails risks, notably because the more these algorithms became sophisticated, and they become more and more sophisticated as they learn, and I'm talking about the part of AI which is about machine learning, there is a risk. And these risks need to be regulated by the sovereign. I'm not saying they should be regulated forever. Things are changing incredibly rapidly. And I know of people who say it's absolutely stupid to regulate today a world that's going to be totally different 5 years from now. I don't buy this argument. I think we can progress by trial and errors. And I think that the public needs to believe that AI is something which is governed, harnessed, in a way that it will not turn against humans or normal political public goods. So we need to regulate it, and we do it in different ways. Now, we all do it. China does it. US did it with the executive order recently, which is good quality. The Chinese system is quite sophisticated and very advanced, and the EU just agreed on the legislative package last week in Brussels, which is, in a way, more precautionary than US or China. But this is our culture for many, many reasons. The Europeans have, a culture which is more inclined to precaution and less to risk. There are good sides of that. There are bad sides of that, by the way. So the question, we're back to what do we do with different regulations? The good thing is that we all in common believe that there are risks. And the nature of the risk, which the Chinese regulation or the EU regulation or the US regulation is meant to address, is quite similar. What differs is the spectrum of what is very risky and what is not risky. We all recognize that we need to regulate because of risk, but we don't have, and that's natural. Risk is a scale between good and bad. Whether something is more risky or not is whether it's worse or better. And good and bad is something which is fundamentally moral or philosophical. It's not a machine that will tell you whether it's good and bad. So that's the issue. And then we have to try and make sure that, again, regulating AI does not fragment too much our digital world. For the moment, there are elements of fragmentation. You have a G7 working group, and China has launched its own forum to discuss that, and UK just invented one. The G20 will probably do it at some stage. So, and it's in a way a bit inevitable, but long term, again, we need more convergence on this. And by the way, I had a long discussion with the UNSG in September when I gave him the Climate Overshoot Commission report. And I mean, he is of the view that the UN should create enough muscle expertise to have a body that is overseeing the way AI is regulated. And I agree with that. It's something which, again, which we will have in common. We have our differences in the way we handle this, but we need an overall arching system that limits divergences and that at least organizes coexistences. And by the way, the Center for European Regulation, which produced the first report about global digital ecosystems at the Paris Peace Forum in 2022, is now working on a new version, this time with separate briefs, the first of which appeared 10 days ago in Brussels, before the legislation was adopted.
Great. You have gave us a lot of a good food for thought. I think EU has already started legislative work on that, and also we'll see how we can really get those different major economy working together and some convergence with possibly WTO. So before I open for our discussion and of course our medias and friends, and my final question is that I cannot let you go without asking a question about WTO. You are one of the key architect of global governance in many ways, like climate and digital and AI. But what about the WTO? We are having the 13th minister meeting comes up in Dubai next year, early next year, and WTO seems to be the driving force, one of the key, very important driving force of globalization. And China probably is the largest beneficiary of WTO, and of course many other countries do. So now WTO has many challenges. We have an appellate body has been basically paralyzed to some extent, and then it's difficult to reach new consensus, even though we did some fishery and other trade liberalization things. But what do you see the WTO ahead, and how can we, China, EU, and US, and secretary, body of the WTO, what more can be done, and how can we really enhance the WTO, which I think in the end people have to come back to the reality. We have so many different divisions, so many new things coming up. We don't have a strong organization like WTO, which in the past 70-some years has greatly changed the world. And so we still have to work together. And you have been 8 years as a DJ of the WTO. What's your vision and reform or advice for WTO, and how we can, China, US, EU can work together as the 3 largest economy in the world?
Okay, we have what, 2.5 hours for that?
No.
Okay.
You can give a 5 minute talk.
So, rapidly, we have 3 problems. The first one is credibility, because of the way the dispute settlement system has been paralyzed by the US. Now, this stems from a wrong interpretation, in my view, of the WTO statute. It was interpreted in a way that the nomination of judges to the appellate body needs to be done by consensus. This is not what the Charter of WTO says. But for a variety of reasons, it was accepted that they should interpret it this way, and nobody else made enough of the case that that was not the right interpretation of the WTO statute. This is a procedural matter. Nominating 7 judges in a body is not something for a consensus or unanimity. But leave that aside. So we have a problem in that, for the moment, the enforcement mechanism, which is the distinctive feature of the WTO, is paralyzed. So this needs to be fixed. And it's going to be fixed in 2 possible scenarios. Either the US re-accept what they have accepted in signing the WTO agreement in 1994, that the dispute settlement is binding on the members. A losing party has to comply, otherwise there will be measures. This is what the US signed in 1994. Do they still stand to this commitment? Yes or no? If yes, you lock 10 WTO negotiators in a room during 2 days, and you tell them they will only go out when they have an agreement, and they will have an agreement. It's perfectly doable. The issues at stake are perfectly negotiable. If the US do not accept to go back to their commitment, then we are in a totally different world. We will need a binding dispute settlement with all the members but the US. And this will mean de facto that the US are stepping out of WTO. This is problem number one. Problem number two is the way the WTO works and the balance between the authority of the Secretariat and the DG and the authority of the members. This notion that the WTO is a member-driven organization does not make sense. Of course, it's driven by its members, like any international organization is created and agreed and framed by the members. But that any sort of decision, which is a serious one, has to go through the consensus of the members, that the DG or the Secretariat have zero authority to table a proposal to fix a trade problem that exists, that has been identified. These people are incredibly good experts. They know the countries, they know their position, they know the problems. So exiting them from the negotiating system is an absurdity. You lose an enormous capacity to do things properly, quickly, scientifically, expertly, politically. It's stupid. And this rebalancing is not on the cards. And the reason why it's not in the cards is that the members want to stick to the notion that they decide everything. I've often quoted an anecdote, which is that when I became DG of WTO, I was given by a former DDG who was an Australian, very witty guy and very good caricaturist. I was given a cartoon with a tree, very nice tree, well drawn with nice big trunk and nice leaves, and a car had crashed into the street. And the car is all over the place, totally broken. And the legend of the cartoon is member-driven car. And I had this cartoon in my office in the WTO. So this is a bad system. It needs to be fixed and rebalanced if you want WTO to work like a normal organization where there is a division between political authority, technical proposals, but this really needs to be fixed. And then third, we need the WTO to address the few issues which I mentioned, like trade and environment, like digitalization, like economic security, like subsidization, which has been there for a long time. But is now a bigger problem than before, because before only China was heavily subsidizing. Now the US are subsidizing as much as China. So it becomes an enormous problem for many poorer developing countries. In a subsidy war, they will be the losers. So these issues need to be addressed. And if you tick these three boxes, you will go back to the normal situation where global market capitalism needs a properly regulated multilateral trade system with obstacles to trade that appear being addressed and reduced in a negotiated, fair way.
Great. You have mentioned all those key points, I think, that we have to address collectively. Now, I would like to open to our discussion. I mean, we have quite a few experts here, and so we'd like to hear from them. Perhaps DJ Sun, you can start first, and you are the former Director General of European department, but I know in the early days also you worked in the international organization liaison department. So maybe your comment, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. LAMY. And we know each other for many years because I was 12 years as a DG for European department in MOFCOM, and with our leaders and with our ministers, we had very serious discussions concerning China-EU trade-related matters. And I have two questions to you. One is that, from January to October this year, the China-EU trade decreased by 7.5%. This haven't been seen for many years, at least, I think, 30 years. In my term as a DG for European Department, and we have very good economic and trade relations. And EU is our #1 trading partner for 16 consecutive years. So we haven't seen this decreasing of our bilateral trade. What your idea of this phenomenon is a kind of a short-term, situation because of the shrinking of the demand from both sides and shrinking of the, not so rosy economic situations in EU and also in China, or because of the three definitions of, EU put China as a, partner, competitor, and systematic rivalry. If that make some sense because of that, rivalry that, EU-China economic relations decrease. This one, question. The other is concerning the investment. We have the so-called, comprehensive agreement on investment. That's, the conclusion was finalized in 2020, and our leader from Xi Jinping and the leaders from the EU announced that we have concluded our discussion concerning the CAI. But because of the Xinjiang, so-called human rights issues, because of the, the geopolitical issues, and this CAI is dead in some way. Do you see any possibilities to revitalize this CAI, to be putting forward in a realistic way? Or in a short term, you don't believe that CAI will be, in the right track in 5 or 10 years even? So that's my two questions to you. Thank you very much.
So on the first question, I think this decrease in bilateral trade stems from 3 factors. One is weaker investment in the previous years. The EU investment in China has decreased consistently for the last 4 or 5 years. In a nutshell, big companies remain in China and keep investing, notably German companies, but the inflow of mid-size companies' investment has dropped. And the reason behind that is the perception in European public opinion that China is less secure than it used to be. And of course, politics play a big role in it. So I think there is an inevitable trade consequence of slowing down of investment flows. The second is that there still are serious obstacles to trade and investment in China. I created, when I was European Trade Commissioner, the EU Chamber in Commerce in China. If you read the report of the EU Chamber, and I know that the Chinese administration does that because they work seriously, there are still too many obstacles to trade and investment from the EU into China, including, by the way, areas where the investment regime for EU is less favorable than for the US, which is a bit of an oddity, at least in my view. And then there is the weak economy on both sides, which of course matters. So that would be, I mean, how much for each of these, I probably do not know, and I should look seriously at the numbers to say it's 30% and 40% and 30%. But that's my sense. Now, on the CAI, on the investment agreement, I will be very candid. China overreacted to a resolution voted by some members of the European Parliament, as sometimes China does. China overreacted with Australia when Australia asked for a body investigating the origins of COVID. I mean, China overreacted when Lithuania did something that could made the vision that the one country, two systems might have been questioned if. But this is, and I will not say more because we all know that within the Chinese system, in this sort of cases, some say, take it easy, and others say, no, boom! You know, there's a proverb, Chinese, which is about frightening chicken to make sure the monkey understands. But that's how it works.
Thank you, Pascal, and also Mr. Sun, CCG Senior Fellow. But I'd like to also Professor Ji Wenhua. He's at the School of Law, University of International Business Economics. You are here also. What's your comment and question?
Okay, thank you very much. And first, I thank President Wang for inviting me here. Also, I would like to thank Your Excellency, Mr. PASCAL LAMY, for your very enlightening and informative presentation and your answers to the questions. Indeed, before President Wang addressed the last question to you, I think I would raise a question about the dispute settlement, because you missed this issue in your previous presentations, and it seemed for me that I remember the reform of the dispute settlement system as a priority of the WTO reform. Since you raised this question, I will go a little bit further, because I meet you when I worked in the Chinese mission to the WTO. You are frequently requested by us to nominate the chair of the panel. So I think I will continue my dialogue with you on this issue. Now, we all know the problem that the US blocked the nomination of the appellate body. So, and the appellate body was paralyzed. There's no incumbent member. You mentioned two possible solutions. One is that the US rejoin the consensus, which means, okay, accept the binding DTU. Another one is that, okay, the US was ousted. And I think, well, of course, and the last situation is not the optimal one. It will cause a huge damage to the multilateral system, not only to the dispute settlement system. So I personally made the proposal, compromise proposal, because at least at this stage, from the proposal tabled by the US in the negotiations, the US has no intent to leave this system. It's just want to not hope the re-establishment of appellate body. So at least the US wish to accept the binding nature, because whether this is their real intention is to be seen during the MC13. My question is that, well, the intention of the US is important. So what's the real intention, or what's the role the EU would like to play? Because China's position is very clear, and in bilateral forum and multilateral forum, China voiced this concern that we wish to have a two-tier binding system. The EU is also a proponent of the binding system and a supporter, even the main proponent of the MPIA. However, under the recent G7 trade ministerial declaration or summit declarations, and the G7 members only repeat what the language in MC 12. There's no further any explanation. So from my perspective, I didn't see EU as a main player wish to exercise further pressure on US to make a further compromise or make its intention clear. So I have a little bit concern with the possible change of the EU's position on this issue. To put my question more clearly, if we cannot make any progress at the MC13 on dispute settlements, the issue, will the EU leave the question as it is, or will coordinate with China and other members to put more pressure on the US? Thank you.
I think we have to go back to the essential. The essential is whether the US or not accept the binding nature of the DSM. And this is unclear. This is unclear. And this is the defining line between an acceptable solution or a non-acceptable solution for the others, including the EU. And we have, I was chief of staff of the president of the EU Commission when the EU round concluded with the Marrakesh Agreement. And the binding nature of the dispute settlement was a last-minute, very last-minute addition, which was negotiated between my predecessor, Leon Britton, and Mike Cantor, who was then USTR, on an instruction of Mr. Delors, who said, we need a binding dispute settlement. Leon Britton was, did what he was told to do, but he's a British. So the notion that we would export to the WTO a sort of a supranational authority was not very familiar to him, but he accepted it. And he convinced Mike Cantor, who was a very shrewd guy, to accept it. And then Mike Cantor went to the US Congress at the moment of ratification and said, well, don't you worry. No, look at the wording. It says that determinations must be adopted by the members. And he didn't insist on the fact that there's a footnote, which was added, which makes the whole difference, which says the losing party cannot oppose the consensus. And of course, if the losing party cannot oppose the consensus, the decision is taken against the losing party, and then it has to comply. So Mike Cantor was very clever. But the fundamental issue behind all this is whether the United States of America accept or not what they have never accepted before, which is the binding authority of a supranational body. Now, I would never put things in this way in Washington because they would be terrified at what they did. But this is the real issue. Now, the reason why Nikkei Cantor convinced Congress, he said, we need a system that will make the others abide. And this will be good for the US, which, by the way, is absolutely true. It's absolutely true that it's good for the US that the others abide. But of course, it's good for the others that the US abide. So this is, I mean, this is the key question. And it's a major political problem for the US. And if I was trying to convince Congress, I would say, if the system does not oblige China to comply, then it's a bad system. And they would say, oh, yes, that's absolutely true. So this is the issue. If this is solved, I think the rest will follow. I think the EU, for the moment, is holding a sort of a tactical position. And if the US make it clear that it remains binding, they will flexibilize their position. And by the way, I also believe that if China was publicly more outspoken on the fact that the system has to remain binding, this would be good for the negotiation and good for China.
That's good advice. I think if both EU and China can, stick together and have a strong voice of this, support this system, that will certainly helps. Now I'd like to invite another expert, Professor Li Siqi. He's at China Institute for WTO Studies at the University of International Business and Economics. And what's your comment and question, please?
Thanks for having me in this roundtable discussion. I have two questions. The first question is regarding the power transformation in the WTO. We all know that there is a leadership deficit in the WTO due to the shifting position of the US, but actually this power transformation has already taken place since China's accession to the WTO upon the Doha round. So what's your perspective on China's current role in the WTO reform agenda? Is that possible for China and other emerging economies or also some developed countries to form a collective leadership role in this WTO reform agenda? My second question is regarding the prospect of the WTO. We all know that we are facing a consensus-based deadlock in multilateral negotiations. So some countries, they have a feasible alternative to turn to the JSI negotiations, but it is against by certain developing members like India, Africa, to question this dual-track negotiation approach in the WTO. So what is your perspective on this JSI approach? Is that could be the mainstream negotiation model in the WTO? So thank you.
On the first one, I think the political reality is that the feeling prevailed until now, for the last 20 years, in China, that the accession ticket was overpaid. This is the feeling on average, and I negotiated the final deal with Premier Zhuangzi himself, and I can understand why in the Chinese system there is a remnant view that accession was paid dear. And it is absolutely true that if you compare the level of development of China in 2000 to Brazil or India or other similar countries at the time, their trade regime is less open than the Chinese one. So, as a consequence of that, China never was very forthcoming to move to a further round of liberalization. And by the way, the best evidence of that is that each time during the negotiation of the Doha round, we would reach a stage where there might be an agreement. China I'm a recently acceded country. So I need a rebate. So that's the reality. Now, given that the area where WTO rules are weak and do not constrain China enough, in my view, but which is also the view of many countries on this planet, who are not as rich as China to subsidize their production system. Given that China knew that if there was to be a new trade opening package, subsidies would come in the discussion, China made sure that they would not be exposed. So if you add these two elements, this explains a certain passivity. Not that China did not abide by its commitment, it did, and I've always said that publicly. When I was EU Trade Commissioner, when I was DG of the WTO, this notion that China cheated the accession and did not properly abide, this is not. China did abide by its obligations, but in the sector of subsidization, the obligations of China were not strong enough. And the ones who are responsible for that are people like me and the USTR and the Japanese trade negotiator at the time, who were the big shots that negotiated China's accession. We, at the time, overestimated the value of market access and underestimated the value of binding rules on subsidization. Because we did not, at the time, we were appetized by the opening of the Chinese market, and rightly so, and the pressure on my back as a negotiator was not about subsidies. The pressure on my back was on opening this and this and this and this, which was not opened enough, like telecoms, for example. But we did not pay enough attention to subsidies, and we thought that the curse which had been initiated by Deng Xiaoping, which is reform, opening, privatization, would be pursued. And we got it wrong. From 2010 on, China changed course, and the state-owned sector re-augmented its proportion in the economy, and the subsidization, as a consequence of that, re-augmented. So we did an error in not properly forecasting what China would be 20 years from then. And by the way, each time, and I wrote this in a piece which was published in a few months ago, when the US trade negotiator and myself discussed the issue of subsidies, both of us were in favor of moving more aggressively on subsidies. But in both of our teams, the lawyers told us, be careful. If you start shrinking the stitches of the net of subsidies, our subsidies will be caught. Airbus and Boeing, for instance. And so we wrongly listened to our lawyers when they told us, be prudent, be careful, we will be caught. So that's the basic explanation of this situation where China abided, but really did not ask for more. Now, on your second question, you cannot, given the implications of removing trade obstacles for countries, you cannot impose a decision on US, China, Europe, or India, let's say. Inevitably, you need a consensus where big trade elephants, US, EU, China, India, are in agreement. Consensus is not unanimity. There is a big difference between consensus and unanimity. Consensus is something you build, and at some stage the chair says, I believe there is a consensus. And if somebody objects, there's somebody else says, oh, no, I disagree. Unanimity is totally different. Unanimity is, are you all in agreement? Please raise your country tag. And this is a totally different group dynamic. So consensus is something you can build. And roughly speaking, if you have an agreement between these major elephants, the deal is done. So it's consensus among the major players and leaders. Now, I'm sure Uruguay or Thailand would not agree with me. Say, we all have to agree. But the experience shows that if this group agrees, it's a balance, basically. US, EU, I could add Japan, because Japan would say, oh, no, I have to be in the... And then you look at the composition of the green room. The composition of the green room, which is a sort of bureau of WTO or executive whatever, that's how it works. So dwelling on consensus or majority is not the right issue.
Okay, good. I think we're running out of time, and maybe I know we had quite a few journalists. There were one interviewed PASCAL before the conference, and we still probably have one quick question for People's Daily correspondent, just quickly. Yeah.
Wait. Thank you, Mr. Lamy. One question, very simple. I'm a reporter from People's Daily Overseas website. You mentioned that Chinese economy is not in good shape before. My question is that despite the challenges, China has achieved success in some areas, such as electric vehicles. So in your opinion, which sector is the highlight of China's economy this year and why? Thank you, sir.
Now, on EVs, China has massively invested with public subsidization in production of EVs. And they've reached a formidable level of cost to quality ratio, notably thanks to these public subsidies. Now, the domestic demand in China for EVs is lower than the capacity which has been built. So China is producing very good price to quality EVs, too much for the internal market, way too much for the internal market, and has to export it. Now, where can China export? Where are the big markets? US, Japan, EU, Turkey. 3 of them are closed to exports of Chinese good quality price ratio EVs. Only one is open, which is Europe. And this is not sustainable. Europe will not absorb only in Europe the overcapacity of the Chinese production system. This has to be either shrunk or shared. It's as simple as that. And I'm the first to recognize that China did extremely well. But if others close, you cannot remain open. If we do that, we'll have a huge political problem with our constituencies. They will have to close their propulsion factories. They will have to keep building their own EV capacity, which they do, but at a slower rate than China, notably because the necessary capex is not subsidized, or less subsidized, although it has now to be subsidized. But that's the situation.
Yeah, probably we have to conclude there, but I just want to add a comment, Pascal. I think that you know, subsidy, of course, is needs to be discussed. I know that U.S. now is starting to have a lot of Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS Act. There's a lot of subsidy. But on the other hand, also, you know, you talk about U.S. close their EV car market, but Tesla make half of the EV car in China, and then they export to Europe too. So probably we need to see, but you know, and also for all those German and many European automakers in China, they are really also developing EV cars here. Also, here is the state of the art technology and R&D center. So probably we need to work on that and to collectively find a way to solve that, so that we can meet the target of you know, carbon peak and carbon neutral. Otherwise, you know, if we start another trade friction or trade war, you know, that probably going to slow down the overall objective of achieving the carbon neutrality, you know, with all the continents countries trying to do. So probably we have.
You're absolutely right, Henry. Tesla sell cars everywhere, but it's a totally different market segment from what the Chinese sell. It's extremely good quality and terribly expensive, whereas the Chinese cars are good quality and very cheap.
Okay, we need to increase the price probably. Anyway, no, again, and I think we had a very good discussion. You have, you know, you've been traveling around. You've been involved in many rounds of global negotiations. Of course, you're leading still on the climate and digital AI, many area front, and also it's great that we have you back and to hear your views and to have a good, candid and constructive discussion. So really appreciate your coming, and also our fellows and our experts and our media friends, and also, of course, we people from embassy, from different think tanks. So on behalf of CCG, I would like to thank PASCAL, you know, our speaker today very much, but also to all the audience coming here today. Thank you very much. We will conclude that. But before you go, I'll give you the a little souvenir, and so this is the latest book we did for Graham Allison and Joseph and I. We hope to do one for you. Okay.